Hello, this is Mike Sherwood-Smith calling from Edinburgh in Scotland, and this is part 3 of the internal context of bilingual processing series, and it's called Assumptions and Principles. Let's see the overview. Okay, so I thought it'd be a good idea to summarize what we've done so far very briefly, and then make some general comments about language cognition. So the first part of the presentation will handle 3 points. Firstly, I'll go over what I said about explanations and the shallower and deeper ones, and then I'll talk about 5 key mental abilities, and then go to what I call the activation story, which is so important for all accounts of either brain or mind. And then we'll go to the second part. Okay, the summary so far. Remember, I talked about explanations being shallower or deeper, and that it was a relative matter. And what I wanted to do was not talk about pre-scientific explanations. Unfortunately, the internet is full of them. Social media is packed with scientific pre-scientific explanations, which, although some of them could be plausible, some of them are wildly imaginative and implausible, nevertheless do not have the backing of rigorous scientific research. So we're not going to talk about pre-scientific explanations. So that leaves us with scientific ones, and they've got 4 basic levels, and these are not levels that you necessarily work from bottom to top, because you can start with very wide-ranging theories, or a kind of beginning of a wide-ranging theory, and then you can start working at the bottom and go upwards towards it, or you can do what mostly happens, or what ideally happens, is that people work at different levels at the same time. So the top level is the large scope theory, and as I say, because it's a relative concept, we have to say progressively larger, but they're by and large very large scope theories which cover a large range of phenomena, usually covered by individual domains, but now kind of comprehensively included in this larger level. Okay. And at the bottom we've got this exploratory working hypothesis, which is what you do when you haven't got much previous research to rely on. You can't see what you're doing as the beginning of a the continuation of a long line of studies. It's typically a new area. No one has done much scientific research in this area, so you start with an exploratory working hypothesis, which will be thought up by some principled speculation and your observation of the phenomena in question, and you will proceed from there. The in-between levels, levels 2 and 3, in the beginning you have an advance on the exploratory level, where you do have a body of research to look at, and you can build on it with new findings and new types of phenomena, but essentially in the same line of research. Or you can challenge something, test it out and challenge some claim based on some data and some experiments. But in a sense, this is a very common area, a level that people work in these days, and it has the merit of not being too ambitious and that allows you to focus on an area with the support of various instruments, experimental instrumentation methods and things used by others, so that whatever you find you can compare it with what other people have found. And then the third level up is the theoretical level, the first theoretical level, where you have relatively small scope theories. They can be quite large, depending on how much phenomena they cover, and they include a set of related hypotheses that follow from the theory, and which can be tested at level 2, and that basically is what I think of as explanation. As you know, the modular cognition framework is definitely at the highest level, and it's a pity if you work at level 2 and you pay no attention to the higher levels, because whatever you find may fit in satisfactorily with your own particular research field, but it may not make sense in a larger context. So it's good to work at 2 levels at the same time, even though you're concentrating more on one. Okay, so turning to the mind and 5 key abilities. The first one is that we're able to represent things. That's clearly a crucial aspect of cognition, and a memory is a second ability, whereby the representations, the knowledge that we have, which is built up of cognitive representations, can be summoned and used on a particular occasion. And cognitive control, which has to do with goals, some of them conscious, some of them subconscious, and that's a sort of the way in which the mind coordinates things, and the coordination can go on at a subconscious level. It doesn't necessarily have to be deliberate, and cognitive control has features a lot in language cognition research recently, because it's claimed that people who know more than one language, by having to control which particular language they use, have developed coordination skills for any kind of task, not just language tasks. Then moving on to consciousness and attention, that is something which is difficult to, or perhaps impossible to explain absolutely comprehensively, but increasingly science is interested in consciousness and a scientific approach to consciousness, and associated with consciousness is attention, and I talked about that. Finally, I mentioned self, the notion of self, who you are, your sense of who you are, but there are in fact 3 selves in the modular cognition framework, and some people even claim there are more, and I talked a bit about that. Okay, so let's look in particular at representations, and remember I was making a very clear distinction between the brain level, the physical brain that you have between your ears, somewhere in there, one hopes, and the system, as it were, the software part, which is the mind. So another word for cognitive system is simply the mind. This is the way we see it. And in our description of a cognitive system, since we don't have to talk about small ensembles of neurons and to what degree they're local in one particular part of the brain, and to what extent they're a network of pathways involving more than one part of the brain, we don't have to look at that. We're not neuroscientists as such, we're cognitive scientists looking at the mind, and we can talk in simple terms of a network of cognitive systems, auditory, visual, the ones I mentioned earlier, and these ones each have a processor and a store, and in the store you will find representations, and these representations will all be composed of primitive elements, and the primitive elements are specific to that particular system, right? So a visual cognition, visual store, has visual elements, and these elements are primitive. They're called primitive simply because they're part of your biological inheritance. You have them at birth. They're the building blocks for making all kinds of representations following your life experience, creating each person an individual collection of representations in their mind. So although you have a very simple system of processor and a store and a finite number of cognitive systems, that might seem very rigid, but in actual fact it gives you the chance of developing an enormously individual and varied mind. So as you see here, we've got the little primitives there. Some of them will probably be connected at birth because you need some organisation from the very start to ensure your survival, but most of them will be like this one, which is a combination of elements. So you build new representations by combining these primitives. There may be visual primitives, auditory primitives, conceptual primitives, all kinds of things. And people doing research in different areas of cognitive science will have their idea about precisely what these primitives are and how they combine. Okay, and then there's what I call the activation story, which is important both when describing the brain, the physical brain, and the mind. We're at the mind level, and remember I had a way of presenting this as with a metaphor of height, so that processing is not an on-off business but is progressive from very low intensity to very high intensity, and at the bottom of that there is a nice blue resting level area, and this is where representatives are currently not activated, they're resting, as it were. So at any given time you will have thousands of representations which are resting. Actually the brain and the mind are constantly active, so even this notion of activation of resting activation is relative. But if we simplify things, we'll just say they're asleep, right? And during current activity we'll have a lot of representations which are representations which are activated up to a certain level, and once they're activated they are in working memory. So when you talk about working memory, it just means a state of activation, and an enormous amount of this processing of going on where representations in various cognitive systems are in an active state, in working memory, is subconscious. So this little area at the top, you see, represents levels of activation which are very intense and in fact resource hungry as a result. And this is probably an exaggeration, it's probably too big, because as I say, conscious processing is the tip of an iceberg. Most of it's underneath in the area we call subconscious, and representations and activation in this area are not in our conscious experience, and just as well as I suggested, because it's a jungle in there and it wouldn't be very nice to know. So we're mercifully protected from all that. However, we do need consciousness, and so when representations are very, very strongly activated, they rise to this level which we call conscious, where we experience things consciously. And at the very topmost part of that conscious area is a situation where one representation dominates over all the rest, and this is the area we call attention. So attention and consciousness are sometimes thought of as quite different things in some accounts. In this account, they're all part of the activation story. So moving on to the second part, just going to say a few things about language cognition. Some important things which need to be kept in mind. And the first thing is that language follows the same general principles of cognitive processing that I've been using to describe auditory processing, visual processing, all the other kinds of special domains which are represented by individual separate cognitive system which exist in your mind as a sort of network of collaborating operators, as it were. And these functionally specialized systems all follow general principles. So it follows that language, which is something we do and which involves processing and representation, also follows these general principles. The next thing is that it involves all cognitive systems. So when you use language, your mind is fully engaged. You're using pretty much every system to, more or less at any given moment when you're using language. Language is massively interconnected with everything else, and that's why it is so important in our definition of what is human. However, many of the cognitive systems that we use we share with other creatures. So we have to make a more specific category, and that is linguistic. Now, linguistic can be used in all kinds of ways, but I'm using it in a very, very specific way, and that is a way in which it only refers to those cognitive systems, some people say one, some people say two, which are specific for language, right? So you have all these systems working when you use language, but two of them are specific to language. They are the linguistic systems. And they're called linguistic systems because together they take care of linguistic structure. They take care of the organization of speech, and they take care of the organization of words and parts of words when we put them in a sequence in order to create utterances, texts of a longer stretches. In short, what we generally refer to as the grammar. And this is what I'm going to describe next time. We need to see how these specifically these two linguistic systems interact with all the other systems when you're using language, and how that relates, we'll get along to that eventually, to the use of more than one language. And that really is all I have to say now. It's 18 minutes, a little longer than I intended. I hope you don't mind. It is the end, and next time we're going to talk about language cognition, the architecture. And I hope that you will join me then and watch it. Any comments, of course, please provide them. I'm very interested in feedback. I didn't say that before, so now's the time I should. Thank you very much, and till next time.